He thought the courtroom was his stage, but he didn't realize the truth had already taken a seat. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above the courtroom, casting a pale, sterile glow across polished wooden benches and neatly stacked case files. The kind of light that made everything feel exposed yet strangely unseen at the same time. And at the center of it all stood Officer Daniel Brooks, shoulders squared, uniform crisp, voice steady with the kind of confidence that only comes from years of being believed without question. His words flowing smoothly as he addressed the judge, each sentence carefully constructed, each detail sharpened just enough to sound convincing, but never enough to invite doubt. And across the room, seated quietly at the defense table, Naomi Carter didn't move, didn't react, didn't interrupt, her hands resting calmly in front of her as if the weight of the moment hadn't settled on her at all. But if you looked closely, really closely, you would notice the stillness wasn't weakness. It was control, the kind that comes from knowing something no one else in the room knows, the kind that waits, patient and precise, for the exact moment to reveal itself. And as Brooks continued, painting his version of the story, there was a subtle shift in the air, almost imperceptible, like the quiet tension before a storm no one sees coming. The jurors leaned forward slightly. The judge's pen tapped once against the bench, and somewhere in the back, a low murmur faded into silence as a tension tightened around his voice, because authority, when spoken confidently, has a way of bending perception, of making even the most questionable claims feel solid, and Brooks knew that. He relied on it. The rhythm of his speech, the firmness in his tone, the slight pause before key words, all of it calculated, all of it rehearsed, and for a moment, it worked. The room leaned in his direction, the narrative settling into place exactly as he intended, and Naomi, she simply watched, her eyes steady, unshaken, as if every word he spoke was something she had already heard before, something she had already prepared for. Imagine standing there, in a room full of strangers, while someone in uniform reshapes the truth right in front of you. Imagine the pressure, the expectation to react, to defend, to fight back immediately. And yet she didn't. She let the silence stretch just enough to become uncomfortable, just enough to make people wonder why she wasn't speaking. And that silence, that controlled, deliberate silence, began to carry its own weight, because sometimes the most powerful response isn't interruption, it's patience. And as Brooks reached the peak of his statement, his voice firm, his posture unwavering, there was a flicker, just a brief one, of something almost invisible crossing Naomi's expression, not fear, not anger, but something quieter, sharper, like a calculation reaching its final step. And in that moment, without a single word spoken yet, the balance in the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that if you were paying attention, you could feel it, the kind of shift that doesn't announce itself until it's already too late to stop. The silence did not break immediately. It stretched, thin and deliberate, like a thread pulled just to the edge of snapping. And in that space, something subtle began to unravel, because confidence, when pushed too far, often exposes the cracks it was meant to hide. And Officer Brooks, still standing firm, shifted his weight ever so slightly as he continued, adding details now, more specific, more certain, as if precision alone could reinforce the version of events he was presenting. But the more he spoke, the more his words started to carry a faint edge of urgency, not enough for most to notice, but enough to register in the quiet corners of the room where doubt begins to take shape. And Naomi Carter, still seated, tilted her head just a fraction, her gaze steady on him, not confrontational, not defensive, simply observant, as if she were listening not just to what he said, but to how he said it, the rhythm, the timing, the small inconsistencies that slip through when a story is repeated too perfectly. And then, almost casually, she reached for a slim folder resting on the table beside her. The movement so controlled it barely drew attention, yet it marked a shift, a silent signal that something was about to change. The judge glanced up briefly, noticing the motion, his expression tightening just enough to suggest curiosity, while a few members of the jury exchanged quick looks, sensing the atmosphere evolving without fully understanding why. And Brooks, catching the movement from the corner of his eye, paused for a fraction of a second before continuing, his voice firm again, but now just slightly louder, as if volume could reclaim control. There was no indication of compliance, he stated, emphasizing each word, but the statement hung in the air differently this time. Heavier, less certain, because now the room was no longer leaning entirely in his direction. Now it was waiting, watching, measuring, and Naomi, finally, lifted her eyes from the folder to meet his. And in that moment, the stillness that had defined her presence transformed into something sharper, more intentional. She did not interrupt. She did not object. Instead, she let his words settle, let them echo just long enough to become fixed in everyone's mind. And then she spoke, her voice calm, even, carrying across the room without force yet impossible to ignore. "Officer Brooks, would you like to review your statement before continuing?" The question was simple, almost polite, but it landed with a weight that shifted the entire dynamic, because it was not a challenge. It was an invitation, and invitations, when offered at the right moment, can be far more unsettling than accusations. Brooks frowned slightly, the first visible crack in his composure. "My statement is accurate," he replied, but the certainty in his tone no longer felt absolute. And Naomi gave a small nod, as if acknowledging his answer, as if she had expected it. And then, with deliberate precision, she opened the folder, revealing documents neatly organized, pages marked, tabs aligned, the quiet order of preparation contrasting sharply with the growing tension in the room. And as she turned the first page, the faint sound of paper against paper seemed louder than it should have been, drawing every eye toward her, because now, without raising her voice, without stepping out of place, she had shifted the focus entirely. The courtroom was no longer listening to Officer Brooks. It was waiting for her. And in that waiting, in that fragile pause before whatever came next, the balance of power began to tilt, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that even Brooks could feel it, a subtle, undeniable shift that no amount of confidence could fully suppress. The room did not breathe. It held itself still as Naomi Carter turned the page with quiet precision, her fingers steady, her posture unchanged, and yet everything about her presence now carried a different weight, because the moment she opened that folder, she was no longer just the woman being spoken about. She became the one defining what would be heard next, and that shift settled over the courtroom like a slow tightening grip, subtle but undeniable, and Officer Brooks felt it, even if he could not yet name it. The way the attention had moved, the way the judge's eyes no longer lingered on him but instead followed the movement of Naomi's hands, the way the jurors leaned not toward his words but toward her silence, waiting, anticipating, measuring, and Naomi did not rush. She allowed the anticipation to build, allowed the quiet to stretch just enough to make every small sound feel amplified. The faint rustle of paper, the soft clearing of a throat somewhere in the back, the distant hum of the lights above, all of it sharpening the moment into something precise and controlled. And then she spoke again, her voice calm, level, carrying no urgency and no hesitation. "Officer Brooks, you stated that there was no indication of compliance," she repeated, not as a challenge, but as a confirmation, as if placing his own words gently back into the center of the room, giving them space to be examined. And Brooks nodded once, quick and firm. "That is correct," he replied, but this time, his voice lacked the effortless ease it carried before. There was a slight tightness, barely noticeable, but enough to signal that the ground beneath him was no longer as stable as it had been moments ago. And Naomi acknowledged his answer with a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she lifted a single document from the folder, holding it carefully, not displaying it yet, not revealing it, just holding it there, suspended in the space between them. And for a second, it felt as though the entire courtroom leaned toward that page, toward whatever it contained, toward the truth it might carry. And she let that moment linger, let the curiosity sharpen into tension before continuing. "And you are certain that your statement reflects the full sequence of events?" she asked, her tone unchanged, still composed, still controlled, but now carrying a quiet precision that cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. And Brooks hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, the kind of hesitation that disappears quickly but leaves an imprint. "Yes," he said again, though this time the word landed differently, less like a foundation and more like a defense. and Naomi's gaze remained steady on him. Not confrontational, not aggressive, simply unwavering, as if she were allowing him every opportunity to stand by his words before the room itself began to question them. And then, slowly, she placed the document on the table, turning it just enough so that it faced the judge, her movements deliberate, measured, each action reinforcing the sense that nothing here was accidental, nothing was reactive. Everything had been prepared, anticipated, calculated long before this moment ever arrived. And the judge leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from passive observation to focused attention as his eyes scanned the page. And that was when the first visible crack appeared, not in Naomi, but in the structure of the narrative that had been carefully built just minutes earlier, because the judge's pen, which had been tapping lightly against the bench before, now stopped completely, and the silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more pointed, no longer neutral but charged with the weight of something being reconsidered. And Brooks noticed it. Of course he did. The change in posture, the stillness of the pen, the way the judge's brow lowered just slightly as he read. And for the first time since he had taken the stand, Brooks shifted his stance, a small adjustment, but one that revealed more than he intended, because certainty does not adjust. Certainty stands still, and now, even without seeing the document, the room understood that something had shifted, something fundamental, and Naomi, still composed, still calm, did not press forward. She did not explain. She did not rush to reveal everything at once. Instead, she allowed the silence to deepen, allowed the judge to read, allowed the weight of the document to settle naturally into the room. Because she did not need to force the truth into the spotlight, she knew it would rise on its own. And as the seconds passed, stretching longer than anyone expected, the attention in the courtroom transformed completely, no longer anchored to authority, no longer guided by confidence alone, but drawn instead to something far more powerful, something quieter, something that does not need to be spoken loudly to be understood. And in that moment, without raising her voice, without changing her posture, Naomi Carter had begun to take control of the entire room. The judge did not speak right away, and that silence, heavier than anything said before, began to press against every corner of the courtroom. Because when authority stops mid-motion, when the rhythm of control breaks, people notice, and they start to question what they thought they understood just moments ago. And as the judge's eyes moved slowly across the document, his expression shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. The slight tightening of his jaw, the narrowing of his gaze, the pause that stretched longer than protocol usually allows, and Officer Brooks saw it. He could not ignore it. Not now. Not when the room had gone so still that even the smallest change felt amplified. And for the first time, his confidence no longer filled the space the way it had before. It hovered instead, uncertain, searching for ground that was beginning to slip away beneath him. And Naomi Carter remained exactly where she had been, composed, steady, her hands resting lightly against the table as if nothing unusual was happening at all. But that stillness now carried authority, not silence for survival, but silence as control. And when the judge finally looked up, his attention did not return to Brooks. It settled on Naomi, measured, deliberate, as if reassessing not just the document in front of him, but the entire structure of the case itself. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice lower now, more careful. "Where did this report originate?" And the question, simple as it sounded, shifted the weight of the room even further, because it acknowledged her not as a subject of the case, but as a source of information, as someone whose role was no longer passive. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "It was filed through a federal oversight channel, Your Honor," she replied, her tone calm, precise, offering just enough information without revealing everything at once. And the judge's eyes flickered briefly back to the document, then toward Brooks, and that glance alone was enough to change everything, because it was no longer a glance of validation. It was a glance of reconsideration, and Brooks felt it immediately, the shift in alignment, the subtle but undeniable movement of authority away from him. And he straightened slightly, as if trying to reclaim control. "Your Honor, I have not been made aware of any such report," he said, his voice firm but now edged with something else, something closer to defense than certainty. And Naomi did not interrupt. She allowed his statement to settle. allowed it to exist fully in the space before responding, because timing, she understood, was everything. And then she spoke. "That is noted," she said, her voice even, neither confrontational nor dismissive, simply acknowledging. And then she added, "However, the report includes a time-stamped record of your filed statement compared to recorded procedural logs." And the words landed differently. They did not accuse, they did not attack, but they introduced something far more difficult to dismiss: verification, structure, evidence that existed outside of opinion. And a faint ripple moved through the courtroom, subtle but real, a shift in posture, a slight lean forward from the jury, a quiet exchange of glances among observers. Because now the narrative was no longer just a matter of perspective. It was becoming measurable, and Brooks opened his mouth to respond, but paused, just for a moment, the kind of pause that reveals thought catching up to instinct. And in that fraction of time, the room saw it, the hesitation that had not been there before. And Naomi, watching closely, did not rush to fill the silence. She let it expand, let it become visible, because silence, when placed correctly, can reveal more than any argument ever could. And the judge, now fully engaged, leaned forward slightly. "Officer Brooks," he said, his tone steady but no longer neutral, "we will need to review this documentation in detail." And that statement, though procedural on the surface, carried a deeper implication. The case was no longer moving in a straight line. It had shifted direction, and Brooks, standing there, felt it fully now, the ground no longer stable, the certainty no longer unquestioned. And Naomi, without raising her voice, without changing her posture, had done something far more powerful than interrupting him. She had changed who the room believed. And once that shift begins, it does not easily reverse, because belief, once shaken, does not return to its original form. And in that moment, the courtroom was no longer a place where Brooks controlled the narrative. It had become a place where the truth, carefully prepared and precisely revealed, was beginning to take its place. The air in the courtroom had changed completely now, no longer carried by routine or assumption, but held in a fragile balance where every word mattered more than the last, and Officer Brooks could feel it pressing against him. The weight of attention no longer supportive but searching, measuring, waiting for something to confirm what had begun to surface beneath the structure of his testimony. And he adjusted his stance again, subtly, as if grounding himself, as if reminding his body to hold steady even as the room itself seemed to shift around him. "Your Honor," he began, his voice controlled, but this time more deliberate, more careful with each word. "There may be a misunderstanding regarding the documentation presented," and the phrasing itself revealed something, a step away from certainty, a move toward explanation. And Naomi Carter watched him without interruption, her expression unchanged, her focus unwavering, because she understood that this moment was not about overpowering him. It was about allowing the truth to emerge naturally, step by step, without resistance, without force. And the judge leaned back slightly, his pen now resting still against the bench, no longer tapping, no longer signaling impatience, but indicating something else entirely: attention, full and undivided. "Then clarify," the judge said simply, and the simplicity of that instruction removed any space for deflection, any room for ambiguity. And Brooks nodded once, drawing a measured breath. "The sequence of events was reported based on my direct observation," he stated. But even as the words left his mouth, they lacked the firm foundation they once carried, because now they existed alongside something else, something documented, something structured, something that did not rely on perspective alone. And Naomi, recognizing the shift, reached once more into her folder, this time retrieving a second document, thinner, but marked with precise annotations, and she placed it beside the first, aligning the edges carefully, as if presenting not just information, but a pattern, something meant to be read together, understood together. And again, she did not rush to explain. She allowed the presence of the documents to speak first, to invite examination, to draw attention without demand. And the judge leaned forward once more, his gaze moving between the pages. And as he read, the silence deepened again. But now it carried a different quality, no longer anticipation, but realization beginning to form, slow and deliberate. like a shape emerging from shadow, and Brooks, watching this unfold, felt it more sharply now, the loss of control, not dramatic, not sudden, but steady, undeniable, and he spoke again, quicker this time, as if trying to re-establish ground. Those logs may not reflect the full context, he said, but the statement, instead of restoring certainty, only introduced more questions, because context, once invoked, invites scrutiny, invites deeper examination, invites comparison, and Naomi's response was immediate, but still calm, still measured. That is why they are paired with the recorded timeline, she said, her voice even, her tone neutral, offering clarification without confrontation. And then, after a brief pause, just long enough to let the words settle, she added, every entry corresponds to a verified time stamp. And that was the moment the shift became undeniable, not just felt, but seen, because verification does not argue, it does not persuade, it simply exists, and in a room built on determining truth, existence carries more weight than assertion, and a quiet ripple moved again through the courtroom, subtle but stronger. Now, as the jurors exchanged longer glances, as the observers leaned forward more openly, as the structure of belief continued to realign itself around something more concrete than before, and the judge, now fully focused, closed the document slowly, his fingers resting against its edge as he looked up, first at Naomi, then at Brooks, and in that look was something new, something that had not been present at the beginning of the proceedings, scrutiny, not broad, not general, but directed, specific, and Brooks felt it immediately, the shift from being the source of authority to being the subject of examination, and Naomi, still composed, still steady, did not press further, she did not need to, because the room had already begun to move in her direction, not because she demanded it, but because the truth she carried was structured, prepared, and undeniable, and in that moment, the balance that had once seemed fixed had fully begun to tilt, not through force, not through volume, but through precision, patience, and the quiet power of evidence placed exactly where it needed to be. By now the courtroom no longer felt like a place where a single voice could control the outcome. It had become something else entirely, a space where every word was weighed, where every pause carried meaning, and where the quiet presence of Naomi Carter had reshaped the entire direction of the proceedings without force or urgency, and Officer Brooks stood in that space. No longer at the center of certainty, but at the edge of scrutiny, and he felt it fully now, the way attention lingered on him not with trust, but with expectation, as if the room itself was waiting for him to reconcile something that no longer aligned. And he cleared his throat, a small, involuntary action that broke the stillness just enough to remind everyone that he was still trying to hold his position. Your Honor, with respect, these materials do not reflect the full context of my actions on that day, he said, choosing his words carefully. But even that phrasing revealed a shift, because context is something invoked when facts alone are no longer enough. And Naomi did not respond immediately. She allowed the statement to settle, to exist fully in the space before addressing it, because she understood that the power of this moment was not in interruption, but in sequence, in letting each piece fall into place exactly when it needed to, and then, with the same calm, precision that had defined her every movement, she reached once more into her folder, this time retrieving a smaller item, a thin, rectangular device, its surface dark, unassuming, almost easy to overlook. Yet the way she placed it on the table gave it weight, significance, presence, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow its focus entirely onto that object, as if instinctively recognizing that it carried something important, something final, and the judge's gaze followed the motion, his expression tightening slightly as he leaned forward. "What is that?" he asked, his tone measured, but now carrying a clear note of anticipation, and Naomi met his question with the same steady composure. "A verified recording, Your Honor," she replied, her voice even, her delivery controlled, offering just enough information to shift the entire dynamic once again, and this time, the ripple through the courtroom was unmistakable, a quiet but collective reaction as the implications settled in. Because recordings do not rely on interpretation, they do not bend to perspective, they simply present what occurred, and Brooks saw it immediately, The introduction of something he had not accounted for, something outside of his narrative, something that could not be adjusted through explanation alone, and for the first time, his expression changed in a way that could not be fully concealed, not dramatic, not obvious, but present. A tightening around the eyes, a slight delay in his response, the kind of reaction that reveals calculation replacing confidence. And Naomi, watching closely, did not rush forward. She allowed that moment to exist, to become visible, to be recognized by everyone in the room. Because sometimes the most powerful shift happens not when something is revealed, but when someone realizes that it is about to be revealed, and the judge, now fully engaged, straightened slightly, his attention fixed on the device. Proceed, he said, the single word carrying more weight than any instruction before it. And Naomi nodded once, acknowledging, then gently turned the device so that it faced the bench, her movements deliberate, careful, ensuring that nothing about this moment felt rushed or reactive. And as her hand hovered briefly over it, just before activating it, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, because now there was no uncertainty left, no ambiguity, only the clear understanding that whatever came next would not be shaped by opinion, but by truth itself. And Brooks stood there, no longer attempting to speak, no longer interrupting, because even he understood that the moment had shifted beyond his control, that whatever was about to be heard would redefine everything that had been said before. And Naomi, still calm, still composed, allowed one final second of silence to pass, just enough to let the weight of the moment settle fully into the room, before moving forward. Because she had not come here to argue. She had come here prepared, and now, step by step, piece by piece, that preparation was unfolding exactly as intended. The moment did not explode. It unfolded, slow and deliberate. As Naomi Carter pressed her finger lightly against the device, and the faint sound of recorded audio filled the courtroom, not loud, not dramatic, but clear enough to cut through every assumption that had been carefully built before it. And at first, it was just ambient noise, the subtle hum of a public space, distant movement, indistinct voices, the kind of background that usually goes unnoticed, but then a voice emerged. Unmistakable, steady, familiar, and the moment it did, the entire room recognized it, because it was Officer Brooks, not as he stood now in uniform, controlled and measured, but in a different setting, a different tone, one that carried none of the polished certainty he had presented moments earlier. And the contrast was immediate, undeniable, his words recorded in real time, aligned with a timeline that no longer depended on memory or interpretation. And Naomi did not look at him. She did not need to. Her attention remained forward, allowing the recording to take its place fully in the room, to speak without interruption, to exist without explanation, because truth, when presented clearly, does not require guidance. And as the audio continued, the subtle shifts became more apparent. The phrasing, the sequence, the details that did not align with what had been stated under oath, not exaggerated, not dramatized, simply different. And that difference was enough. Enough to create doubt where certainty once stood, enough to fracture the narrative that had been presented so confidently. And Brooks stood still, but not in control, his posture rigid now, not from authority but from containment, as if any movement might reveal more than he intended. And the judge listened without interruption, his expression no longer neutral, no longer passive, but focused, intent, absorbing every word with the kind of attention reserved for moments that redefine outcomes. And the jurors, once leaning toward Brooks, now sat differently, their focus sharpened, their expressions tightened, as if recalibrating everything they had heard before. And the room itself felt smaller, more concentrated, every sound more pronounced, every silence more significant. And then the recording reached a point where the discrepancy could not be overlooked, a statement made in the moment that directly conflicted with what had been declared in court, not dramatically, not loudly, but clearly enough that no one needed it explained. And Naomi, still composed, allowed the audio to continue just a few seconds longer before gently stopping it, the soft click of the device marking the end of something far larger than a recording, marking the collapse of a version of events that could no longer stand. And for a moment, no one spoke, because there are moments when words become unnecessary, when the truth has already filled the space completely. leaving nothing else to add, and Brooks finally shifted, a small movement, but one that carried weight now, because it was no longer the movement of someone in control, it was the movement of someone adjusting to a reality that had changed without his consent, and Naomi lifted her eyes then, meeting his gaze for the first time since the recording began, not with triumph, not with accusation, but with something steadier, something more grounded, the quiet certainty of someone who had never needed to raise her voice to be heard. And the judge exhaled slowly, the sound subtle but noticeable in the silence, before placing his pen down fully, not tapping, not moving, simply setting it aside, a gesture that signaled the moment had shifted beyond routine procedure. "Officer Brooks," he said, his tone measured but firm, no longer carrying the same balance as before, "we will address this discrepancy." And the word discrepancy hung in the air, understated but powerful, because it acknowledged what everyone in the room had already understood, that the narrative had changed, and Naomi, without moving, without adding anything further, allowed that understanding to settle, because she had not needed to argue, she had not needed to interrupt, she had only needed to present what was already there, waiting, and in that moment, the courtroom was no longer divided between belief and doubt. It had crossed into something clearer, something undeniable, where the truth no longer competed for attention, it held it completely. What followed was not chaos, not raised voices or sudden reactions, but something far more powerful, a controlled unraveling, the kind that happens when truth does not need to fight to be heard because it has already taken its place, and the courtroom sat in that stillness, absorbing what had just been revealed, the recording no longer echoing in sound but lingering in memory, reshaping every word that had come before it. And Officer Brooks stood there, no longer speaking, no longer attempting to guide the narrative, because the space for that had quietly disappeared, replaced by something firmer, something structured, something that could not be redirected with explanation alone. And the judge, now fully grounded in this new reality, leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady, his posture no longer neutral but intentional. "Officer Brooks," he said again, this time with a tone that carried authority not just from position, but from clarity, "your testimony will be reviewed in light of this evidence." And the phrasing was careful, procedural, but beneath it lay something unmistakable, a shift from acceptance to examination, from assumption to verification, and Brooks nodded once, slower this time, as if acknowledging a process that had already begun moving beyond his control, and Naomi Carter remained still, her presence unchanged, her composure intact, because she had never entered this room to react. She had entered it prepared, and now that preparation was speaking for itself, line by line, piece by piece, and the judge turned his attention back to the documents, flipping through them with more focus now, connecting what he had heard to what he was reading, aligning the timeline, the statements, the recorded moments, and as he did, the structure of the case continued to shift, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a steady precision that left little room for doubt, and the jurors followed that shift, their attention anchored not in authority, but in consistency, in alignment, in the quiet logic of evidence that did not need to be explained twice. And a subtle change passed through the room, the kind that cannot be seen directly, but can be felt in posture, in breathing, in the way people listen when they realize something important is unfolding in front of them. And Naomi, recognizing that moment, finally moved again, not quickly, not forcefully, but with the same deliberate control that had guided her from the beginning. She gathered the documents slightly, aligning them once more, then looked toward the judge. "Your Honor, these materials were submitted as part of an ongoing federal review," she said, her voice calm, her tone steady, offering context now that the foundation had been established, and the words carried weight, not because they were loud, but because they connected everything that had just been revealed to something larger, something beyond the room itself. And the judge's expression shifted again, not in surprise, but in recognition, as if understanding that this case was no longer isolated, no longer contained within the boundaries of a single testimony. And Brooks heard it too, the implications settling in, not all at once, but enough to understand that what was unfolding reached further than he had anticipated, and for a brief moment, he seemed to consider speaking again, to respond, to clarify. But the timing was no longer his. The space had moved on, and Naomi, without raising her voice, without pressing further, allowed that realization to settle fully, because she understood that once the truth aligns with structure, with documentation, with verification, it does not need to be pushed, it moves on its own, and the judge, now holding both the documents and the weight of what had been revealed, placed them carefully on the bench, his hands resting on either side as he looked out over the courtroom. And in that moment, the balance had fully shifted, not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more enduring, the quiet, steady presence of truth placed exactly where it needed to be. And Naomi Carter, who had entered the room as someone being questioned, now stood at the center of something entirely different, not because she claimed authority, but because she revealed it, piece by piece, until there was no longer any doubt left to question. The courtroom did not return to what it had been, because once truth takes hold, it does not step back into silence. It settles, it reshapes, it redefines everything that follows. And in that stillness, the kind that comes after something undeniable has been revealed, the judge straightened fully, his posture no longer reflective but decisive, his voice carrying a clarity that had not been present at the beginning of the proceedings. This court will recess briefly to review all submitted materials in full, he said, and though the words were procedural, their weight was unmistakable, because they confirmed what everyone in the room had already begun to understand, that the narrative presented earlier could no longer stand as it was, and Officer Brooks remained where he stood, but the space around him had changed, no longer reinforcing his authority, no longer echoing his certainty. Instead, it held something quieter, something heavier, the awareness of being seen differently, of being measured against something more than confidence alone. And he lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that comes when control shifts in a way that cannot be reversed by words alone. And Naomi Carter watched none of it with triumph, none of it with visible satisfaction, because that had never been the point. Her focus remained forward, grounded, steady, as if this moment was not an ending, but a continuation of something that had been set in motion long before anyone else in the room had realized it. And as the judge gathered the documents once more, aligning them with deliberate care, the quiet authority of his actions mirrored the precision that had brought the case to this point. And when he rose, signaling the temporary pause in proceedings, the room followed, chairs shifting softly, footsteps restrained, voices held low, because even in movement, the weight of what had occurred remained present, and Brooks stepped back slightly from his position, his posture no longer rigid with control, but recalibrated, aware, as if adjusting to a reality that had expanded beyond the version he had prepared for. And Naomi stood as well, collecting her folder, the same one she had opened with such quiet certainty, now closing it with the same measured control, as if nothing about her presence needed to change for the truth to remain exactly where it was. And for a brief moment, as people began to move, as the structure of the room loosened just enough to allow motion again, their paths aligned, not directly, not confrontationally, but close enough that the space between them carried meaning. And Brooks glanced toward her, just once, not with authority, not with dismissal, but with something else entirely, something closer to understanding, and Naomi met that glance. Briefly, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, but unmistakably clear, because she did not need to say anything for the moment to be understood. And as she turned and walked toward the exit, her steps steady, unhurried, the quiet echo of them marking a transition that had already taken place. The courtroom behind her no longer defined by assumption, no longer shaped by unchecked authority, but by something far more enduring, something that does not need to raise its voice to be heard, because it stands on its own, undeniable. And as the doors opened and closed behind her, leaving the room to absorb what had been set in motion, the truth remained, not as a sudden revelation, but as a steady presence, one that had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to be seen. And in the end, it was not the loudest voice that defined what happened in that courtroom. It was the one that did not need to speak until it mattered most.